Good morning everyone, and welcome to the 37th daily devotion on the epistle of James. I'm in James chapter 4, verses 15 to 17 today. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now ye rejoice in your boastings, all such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And we're sure that God will bless His word. I'd like to speak today on the great subject, the vital subject of the will of God in our lives. This verse starts with the words, you ought to say. And that stands in contrast with verse 13, where it says, go to now ye that say, today or tomorrow we'll go into a city and continue there a year. Verse 13 is about a plan for my life without God, whereas here in verse 15, it's the providence of God, it's God's plan for my life. It's very clear that we should be making our plans with the Lord, saying, if the Lord will, we shall live, we shall do this or we shall do that. This isn't a formula. This is a real sense that we are in His hands and under His authority. God has a way of blowing on our plans if we neglect Him. Haggai speaks about putting our money into a bag with holes. Everything just seems to come to nothing. But this will here in this verse 15 is not God's absolute will, where we read in Isaiah, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. The absolute will of God was that His Son would go to a cross and die on Passover Day outside Jerusalem city gates. And God's will can't be thwarted. That's His absolute will. But that's not what's here. It's the will of God for my life. And it's good to know that God has a higher plan for my life. It certainly helps in days of trouble. When Paul was a prisoner of Rome and of Caesar, he didn't call himself a prisoner of Rome. He called himself a prisoner of the Lord in Ephesians 3:1. When people began to question why the great apostle Paul was restricted and restrained in prison, he writes in Philippians 1, he says, it's all for the furtherance of the gospel. He says, it's providing me opportunity to preach to the Praetorian Guard, and many of Caesar's own guard are getting saved. And he saw opportunity in affliction. And it's good when we can acknowledge that in God's plan for our life, and it can transform the difficulties and the afflictions that we're facing. But we can know the Lord's will in our life. Paul, when he's writing to the Ephesians, says, understanding what the will of the Lord is. When writing to the Romans, he says, proving what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The Lord Jesus says, if whosoever shall do the will of God, the same as my brother and my sister and my mother. So the intimacy of a knowledge of the Lord is essential if we're going to do His will. And Apostle Paul says that when he went on a journey, he would seek the mind of God in it. He says in Romans 1, making a request, if now by any means at length I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto you. Ezra stopped the journey in Ezra 8 because he couldn't discern the mind of God, and didn't move until he knew what God's will was for him. And wise people continue to do the same. And Paul says it's not just journeys. He says it's your daily work. He says you don't just live to please the boss, he says, with one eye on him. He says it's not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ doing the will of God from the heart. And so the will of God is the guiding principle in the Christian's life. It stands in contrast with verse 16. Verse 15 is the providence of God. Verse 16 is the pride. But ye now rejoice in your boastings, and all such rejoicing is evil. The word boasting is the same word as pride in 1 John 2, the pride of life. And the boastful thoughts are, I'll make these plans and they'll all work out and they'll all be very successful. There's no thought of any failure in them. And there's no thought that their life is just like a vapour that appears and vanishes away. As Robert Burns says, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee go often awry. Boastful claims of past success and future predictions is not just foolhardy, James says here, it's evil. And when we come into verse 17, we move from the providence of life in verse 15 and the pride of life in verse 16 to the possibilities of life and indeed to the positivity of life. He says, he that knows to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. This is not me planning my life without God, like in verse 16, but this is knowing God's plan for my life and not doing it. This is when God provides me the means and equips me to do some good act. He provides the moment, the opportunity to do the good act, and He provides the motivation in my heart to do the good act, but I don't do it. And the Bible speaks about sins of omission as well as sins of commission. And I have to realise that God is giving me a series of opportunities in my life to do good. And that is one of the great blessings of the will of God, rather than a pursuit of selfish goals. But if I fail to do these good things, then I'm sinning. And the providence of God for my life is not just to preserve me from trial, it's not just to protect me in journeys or push me and guide me in life's major decisions and directions, but it's also to provide for me the opportunity to do good. This is one of my highest privileges, to do good to others, and I've not to miss life's golden opportunities. So, let's remember then the pattern prayer of the Lord Jesus. Let's do his will on earth as it is in heaven. Tomorrow, God willing, we'll deal with the subject, not so much the will of God, but the wealth and power that's found in the first few verses of chapter 5. God bless.